Sarah Mitchell pulled her weathered A-10 Thunderbolt II into a gentle bank, watching the morning sunlight dance across the Arizona landscape below. The desert stretched out beneath her like a copper blanket, ridges and valleys creating shadows that seemed to shift and breathe as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced familiarity, every switch and dial responding just as she expected. After 12 years of flying this particular aircraft affectionately, known as the Warthog by pilot Sarah, knew its every quirk and characteristic. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. November 6352, maintain current altitude and heading, weather system approaching from the northwest, came the voice of the air traffic controller through her headset. Copy that, control. November 6-3-5-2, maintaining course and altitude. Sarah responded, her voice calm and professional, despite the excitement that always accompanied these early morning flights. The A-10 beneath her was technically obsolete by modern Air Force standards, while sleek F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning IS dominated the skies with their stealth capabilities and advanced avionics. Sarah's Warthog was a relic from another era. Designed in the 1970s for close air support and attacking armored vehicles, the A-10 was never meant to be pretty or sophisticated, just effective. Most had been retired years ago, but this particular aircraft, tail numbers 635 to 147, had found its way into Sarah's hands through a series of unlikely events. Sarah had spent 8 years in the Air Force as a maintenance engineer before transitioning to civilian life and eventually becoming a pilot. When the military decided to auction off several decommissioned A-10s, she'd scraped together every penny she had to purchase one. Her colleagues thought she was crazy. Her family worried she was wasting her savings. But Sarah had always felt a connection to these rugged, reliable aircraft that others dismissed as dinosaurs. "You're flying that thing again?" Her brother, Jason, had asked just last night during their weekly video call. "When are you going to upgrade to something built in this century?" "When they make something better," Sarah had replied with a smile, knowing full well her definition of better differed significantly from most modern pilots. She adjusted her heading slightly, following the contours of the mountain range that separated the desert from the fertile valleys beyond. The A-10 responded with its characteristic solidity, no fancy fly-by-wire controls or computer assistance, just straightforward mechanical reliability. In an age of touchscreens and voice commands, there was something reassuring about the analog gauges and physical switches that populated her cockpit. Sarah worked as a contract pilot now, mostly conducting aerial surveys for environmental research teams and occasionally helping with search and rescue operations when the terrain was too challenging for helicopters. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept her in the sky, two things she valued equally. Her radio crackled to life again. November 6352. Be advised we're tracking unusual weather patterns developing in your vicinity. Recommend altering course to heading 270. Sarah checked her instruments, frowning slightly. The sky ahead looked clear enough, though there was a faint haze on the horizon that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. Still, the instruments didn't lie, and neither did air traffic control. "Roger that, control. Altering course to 270. As she turned the aircraft, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the modifications she'd made to her A-10 over the years. While the exterior looked much as it had during its military service, perhaps a bit more weathered, the internals told a different story. She'd installed updated navigation systems, reinforced the already legendary durability of the airframe, and enhanced the communication equipment to modern specifications. The result was an aircraft that combined the best of old-school reliability with enough modern amenities to remain relevant in contemporary airspace. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't air traffic control. The voice was different, tighter, more urgent. "Attention, unidentified A-10. This is Captain Reynolds of the 61st Fighter Squadron. You are approaching restricted airspace. Identify yourself and alter course immediately." Sarah blinked in surprise. She'd checked her flight plan carefully before takeoff, and there was no restricted airspace marked on this route. She double-checked her position against her charts and confirmed she was well within civilian airways. 61st Squadron, this is civilian aircraft, November 6352. My charts show no restricted airspace in this vicinity. Please advise. There was a brief pause before the response came. November-6-3-5-2. The restriction was implemented 20 minutes ago due to an ongoing military exercise. Turn to heading 180 immediately. You will be intercepted and escorted out of the area. Sarah frowned but complied, banking the A-10 to the new heading. As she did, she caught sight of movement to her right, two sleek shapes approaching. Rapidly, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at a distance. F-22 Raptors, the pride of the modern Air Force, were moving to intercept her. The lead F-22 pilot's voice came through her radio, casual and slightly condescending. November 6352, this is Raptor 1. We have visual. You're flying that old Warthog by choice, or did your time machine break down somewhere over Korea? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah bit back a sharp retort. She'd encountered this attitude before, the dismissive superiority some fighter pilots displayed toward anything they considered outdated or inelegant. Instead, she kept her voice professional. Raptor 1, November 6352. Just following my filed flight plan. No time travel involved, though this bird has certainly seen its share of history. The second F-22 pilot chimed in, not bothering to hide his amusement. Check it out, Reynolds. That thing's so old it probably has actual bullet holes patched up. Museum called. They want their exhibit back. Sarah watched as the two Raptors took up escort positions on either side of her A-10. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Their sleek, angular designs representing the cutting edge of aviation technology, while her Warthog, with its straight wings and utilitarian appearance, seemed to belong to another era entirely. "All right, November 6352, the lead pilot continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. We'll escort you to the boundary of the restricted area. Maintain current heading and altitude. Copy that, Raptor 1. As they flew in formation, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Pride in her aircraft, despite its age and appearance, irritation at the dismissive attitude of the F-22 pilots, and curiosity about what kind of military exercise had prompted such a sudden airspace restriction. The lead F-22 pilot's voice returned, this time with a hint of genuine interest beneath the professional exterior. That's an interesting tail number you're flying. 635147 isn't the standard A-10 designation I'm familiar with. Something in his tone caught Sarah's attention. Before she could respond, the second pilot cut in. Wait a minute. Control, can you run a check on that tail number? 635147. There was a long pause, longer than such a simple request should have warranted. When the response finally came, it wasn't from either pilot but from a new voiceholder, with the unmistakable authority of senior command. November 6352, this is Colonel James Harrison, commanding officer of the 61st Fighter Squadron. Please confirm your full tail number and the name of your aircraft's original pilot, if known. The question was unusual enough to make Sarah hesitate. She knew the history of her A-10 well. It had been part of what drew her to this particular aircraft when it came up for auction. But why would a squadron commander be personally requesting this information? Colonel Harrison, this is November 6352. Full tail number is 635147. The original pilot was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Mitchell. USAF retired. He flew this aircraft during Operation Desert Storm and in the early days of Operation Enduring Freedom. There was another long pause, and Sarah could almost feel the tension building across the radio link. When Colonel Harrison spoke again, his voice had changed completely, the professional detachment replaced by something that sounded almost like reverence. "Miss Mitchell, are you related to Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell?" Sarah was stunned. How? Did he know her name? Her civilian call sign didn't include her surname. "Yes, sir. He was my father." The radio went silent again. Sarah glanced at the F-22 flying off her wing and was surprised to see the pilot looking directly at her cockpit, his expression unreadable behind his flight mask, but his posture somehow different, more attentive, less casual. Colonel Harrison's voice returned, measured and deliberate. "Miss Mitchell, your father's aircraft was involved in an operation codenamed Sandstorm Sentinel in 2002. This operation remains classified, but the aircraft you're flying, it has a significant place in our squadron's history." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cockpit temperature. Her father had never spoken much about his military service. He'd taught her to fly, encouraged her Air Force career, and supported her decision to purchase his old A-10 when it became available. But he'd always been vague about certain missions, certain periods of his service that seemed to exist in a gray area of his memory. "I wasn't aware of any operation by that name, Colonel. My father didn't discuss most of his missions." "That's understandable," Colonel Harrison replied. Raptor 1 and 2, change of plans. Escort November 6352 to Holloman Air Force Base. "Ms. Mitchell, would you be willing to land at our facility? There are some people here who would be very interested in seeing that aircraft again." Sarah hesitated only briefly. Her curiosity was piqued, and the possibility of learning something new about her father's service and her aircraft's history was too intriguing to pass up. "Copy that, Colonel. I'd be happy to comply." As the formation altered course toward Holloman Air Force Base, Sarah noticed a distinct change in the behavior of her F-22 escorts. The casual mockery had vanished, replaced by a professional courtesy that bordered on deference. The lead pilot even repositioned slightly, giving her a 10 more space than strictly necessary, as if suddenly concerned about crowding her. November 6352. Raptor 1. Adjust heading to 0905 for direct approach to Holloman. You'll have priority landing clearance. Copy, Raptor 1. Adjusting heading. As they approached the airbase, Sarah could see unusual activity on the ground. Vehicles were moving toward the runway, and figures were gathering near the tower. Something about her aircraft or its history had clearly triggered significant interest. The landing was smooth, the A-10's robust landing gear absorbing the impact with practiced ease. As she taxied toward the designated area, Sarah saw a group of Air Force personnel waiting, including several senior officers judging by the uniforms. Among them stood an older man in civilian clothes, whose posture immediately struck her as military, despite the lack of uniform. After completing her shutdown procedures, Sarah removed her helmet and opened the canopy. The desert heat hit her immediately, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled cockpit. She climbed down the ladder with practiced ease, her flight suit slightly damp with perspiration from the morning's unexpected events. The older civilian approached first, his face weathered by years of sun and wind, his eyes sharp and evaluating. As they moved from Sarah to the aircraft behind her, "Ms. Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I'm General David Whitmore, retired. I served with your father during Operation Sandstorm Sentinel. That aircraft you're flying, it's not just any A-10. Sarah shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip despite his age. "It's a pleasure to meet you, General. I'd be interested to know what makes my father's old Warthog so special." He never mentioned anything unusual about it. General Whitmore nodded, as if her father's silence was exactly what he'd expected. Marcus always was tight-lipped about that operation. Classification requirements, partly, but I think it was more than that. Some experiences are difficult to translate into words. He gestured toward the base buildings. Would you join us? Inside? There's a story about that aircraft that you should hear, a story that explains why those young hotshots in there, F-22s, suddenly changed their tune when they realized what they were escorting. Sarah glanced back at her A-10, its weathered frame standing out starkly against the backdrop of modern fighter jets on the tarmac. She'd always known it was special to her, at least. But now she was beginning to suspect it held significance far beyond her personal connection. Lead the way, General. I think it's time I learned exactly what my father's old Warthog is famous for. As they walked toward the base buildings, Sarah noticed several mechanics and ground crew members looking at her aircraft with expressions ranging from curiosity to what appeared to be awe. One older technician actually stopped what he was doing and saluted as they passed, though she wasn't in uniform and held no military rank. The mystery of tail number 635 to 147 was about to unravel, and Sarah Mitchell found herself equally excited and apprehensive about what she was about to learn about her father's legacy and the true history of the aircraft she had come to love. Inside the briefing room, the air conditioning was a welcome relief from the desert heat. Maps and tactical displays covered the walls, and a large conference table dominated the center of the room. Colonel Harrison was already there, along with several other officers Sarah didn't recognize. As she entered, they all stood a mark of respect that surprised her. "Please sit," Colonel Harrison said, gesturing to an empty chair. "General Whitmore has suggested we share some information about your aircraft. While aspects of Operation Sandstorm Sentinel remain classified, the Joint Chiefs have authorized disclosure of certain details to family members of participating personnel." Sarah took the offered seat, her curiosity mounting with each passing moment. "I appreciate that, Colonel, but I'm still not clear on why my father's old A-10 is causing such a reaction. It's a good aircraft, reliable, durable, but it's hardly unique." General Whitmore smiled slightly as he took the seat beside her. "That's where you're wrong, Ms. Mitchell. You're A-10. Tail number 635 to 147 is very unique indeed. It's the only aircraft in Air Force history to successfully execute what we now call a sentinel extraction under combat conditions." He nodded to Colonel Harrison, who pressed a button on a remote. The lights dimmed, and a projection screen descended from the ceiling. Images appeared: satellite photos of mountainous terrain, tactical maps with flight paths marked in red, and photographs of a younger version of the A-10 Sarah now owned. Helicopters couldn't navigate the valley safely, and other fighter aircraft lacked the low-speed handling characteristics needed for the extraction. General Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes meeting Sarah's directly. "That's when your father volunteered." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was stationed at a forward operating base about 300 miles from the stranded F-22s. He proposed a solution that everyone else considered suicide: flying his A-10 through the sandstorm, navigating the valleys, using terrain-following techniques, and extracting the pilots one by one. Sarah stared at the images on the screen, trying to imagine her father, always so calm and methodical in her memory, volunteering for what sounded like an impossible mission. But the A-10 isn't designed for personnel extraction. It doesn't have the capacity. "Correct," Colonel Harrison nodded. "Which is why your father modified his aircraft in the field. He removed non-essential equipment, reinforced the landing gear for multiple rough field landings, and adapted the communication systems to function through the electronic interference, all within 12 hours of the F-22s going down." "General," Whitmore's voice softened. "What your father did next became known as the Sentinel Extraction Protocol. He flew that A-10 through a Category 3 sandstorm, navigating solely by terrain mapping and instinct. He landed in valleys barely wide enough for the wingspan, in zero visibility, 8 separate times. Each time he extracted one F-22 pilot and flew back through the storm to deliver them to safety before returning for the next. The mission took 17 hours of continuous flying, Major Peterson added. No refueling, minimal rest between extractions. By all normal standards of aviation, it should have been impossible. The physical toll alone. I remember, Sarah interrupted. Suddenly, a childhood memory surfacing with unexpected clarity. I was 14. Dad came home from a deployment and slept for almost 2 days straight. When he woke up, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold a coffee cup. Mom said it was just fatigue, but it was more than that, General. Whitmore finished for her. Your father pushed human endurance beyond what we thought possible that day. The physical strain of controlling an aircraft through those conditions for that duration, it left its mark. Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions: pride in her father's courage, concern about what the mission had cost him, and a new understanding of the aircraft she'd been flying all these years. Why didn't he ever tell me? All these years. I've been flying this A-10, and he never once mentioned what it had been through. Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with General Whitmore before responding. Classification was part of it. But for many who serve in special operations, there's also a reluctance to revisit certain experiences. Your father saved 8 lives, and 8 aircraft worth billions in technology. But the method, the Sentinel extraction protocol, was deemed dangerous for standard implementation. Too dependent on one pilot's extraordinary skills. Until now, General Whitmore said quietly. Sarah looked up sharply. What do you mean, until now? The officers exchanged glances again, and Colonel Harrison leaned forward, his expression grave. Ms. Mitchell, approximately 3 hours ago, we lost contact with 8 F-22 Raptors, conducting training exercises near the Sierra Blanca range. Initial reports indicate a situation disturbingly similar to Sandstorm Sentinel electronic warfare, combined with extreme weather conditions. The aircraft are believed to have made emergency landings in terrain that makes conventional rescue problematic. You can't be serious, Sarah said, the implications dawning on her. You're not suggesting. We're not suggesting anything, General Whitmore interrupted gently. We're merely sharing historical information about your aircraft. What you choose to do with that information is entirely your decision. But his eyes told a different story, and Sarah understood the unspoken question hanging in the air. History was repeating itself, and once again, a Mitchell was sitting in a briefing room with an A-10 parked outside, an A-10 that had once done the impossible. How bad is the situation? She asked finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions beneath. Colonel Harrison pressed another button, and the screen showed current weather radar and topographical maps of the Sierra Blanca range. 8 pilots, all alive based on emergency beacons. Aircraft intact but grounded in narrow valleys with steep approaches. Weather system intensifying with winds exceeding 60 knots. Electronic interference preventing normal communication and navigation systems from functioning reliably. And conventional rescue options? Being attempted, Major Peterson replied, but facing the same challenges as before. Helicopters can't safely navigate the wind conditions in the canyons. Other fixed-wing aircraft lack the necessary low-speed handling characteristics for the confined spaces. Sarah stood up and walked to the screen, studying the topography and weather patterns. She wasn't military anymore, but her civilian survey. Work had given her extensive experience with precisely this kind of challenging terrain. And her father's A-10 had been modified even further since its military days, with enhanced navigation systems and reinforced landing gear that might make it even more suitable for this kind of mission than it had been 20 years ago. "I'd need current coordinates for all 8 pilots," she said finally, still facing the screen. "Weather updates every 15 minutes. And a secure communication channel that can penetrate the interference." The room fell silent behind her. When she turned back, she saw expressions ranging from relief to concern to outright skepticism. "Ms. Mitchell," Colonel Harrison began carefully, "we appreciate your willingness, but I want to be absolutely clear, no one is ordering you to attempt this. You're a civilian pilot. This would be completely voluntary, and frankly, just as dangerous as it was when your father attempted it." "More dangerous," General Whitmore corrected quietly. "The electronic warfare capabilities in play today are significantly more advanced than what we faced in 2002. Sarah looked at them both, then at the image of her A-10 still displayed on one corner of the screen. Tail number 635 to 147, the aircraft. That had done the impossible once before. "My father never told me about Sandstorm Sentinel," she said slowly. "But he taught me everything he knew about flying that A-10. Every technique, every handling characteristic, every way to coax performance out of a machine that most pilots never discover. I always wondered why he was so thorough, so insistent. That I understand the aircraft at a level beyond what seemed necessary." She paused, a smile touching her lips briefly. "Now I know. He wasn't just teaching me to fly. He was passing on what he'd learned that day, everything that had kept him alive and allowed him to save those pilots." Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment. "You're suggesting you want to attempt a Sentinel extraction?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "I'm suggesting that there are 8 pilots out there in aircraft that cost $150 million each, facing conditions that make conventional rescue impossible. And I'm flying the only aircraft that's ever successfully extracted pilots from this exact scenario, piloted by someone who was trained by the man who wrote the original protocol." She straightened her shoulders, decision made. "So yes, Colonel, I want to attempt a Sentinel extraction. And I'd like to begin preparations immediately." The room erupted into controlled chaos, officers issuing orders and technicians being summoned. As Sarah watched them prepare for a mission that had been deemed impossible once before, she thought about her father and wondered if he had felt this same mixture of determination and fear when he volunteered 20 years ago. Outside, through the briefing room window, she could see her A-10 Thunderbolt II sitting on the tarmac, old, weathered, dismissed as obsolete by modern standards, but ready, as it had always been, to do what newer, more advanced aircraft could. Not. The briefing room had transformed into a command center, officers and technicians working with focused intensity as they prepared for what everyone acknowledged was a high-risk mission. Sarah Mitchell stood at the center of it all, absorbing information as quickly as it was presented to her. Weather patterns, terrain maps, last known coordinates, emergency beacon signals, each piece forming part of the complex puzzle she would need to solve in the air. "The electronic interference is concentrated in these 3 sectors," Major Peterson explained, highlighting areas on the digital map. "It's disrupting standard navigation systems and communications. Your A-10's analog backup systems might actually be an advantage here, less vulnerable to sophisticated jamming." Sarah nodded, studying the terrain. "What about the pilot's conditions?" "All reported safe after emergency landings," Colonel Harrison replied. "Each has survival gear and approximately 72 hours of supplies. But the weather system is intensifying. Our window for extraction is narrowing." A young technician approached with a tablet. "Ms. Mitchell, we've uploaded the most recent satellite imagery to your personal device. The resolution isn't ideal due to the storm conditions, but it's the best we can provide." Sarah took the tablet, swiping through images of narrow valleys and rocky outcroppings, partially obscured by swirling dust and clouds. The terrain was challenging, perhaps even more so than what her father had faced during the original Sentinel mission. But it wasn't impossible. Not for an aircraft designed to operate close to the ground in hostile conditions. What about communication? With the stranded pilots, she asked. Intermittent at best, another officer replied. We've established a frequency that seems to penetrate the interference about 60% of the time. Each pilot has been instructed to maintain position and signal with emergency flares when they hear aircraft approaching. General Whitmore, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Sarah, before you commit to this, there's something else you should know. He gestured for her to follow him to a quieter corner of the room. When they were relatively private, he lowered his voice. The original Sentinel extraction protocol included a technique your father developed, something he called valley threading. It involved flying patterns that conventional wisdom said were impossible, especially in an aircraft the size of an A-10. Sarah frowned. He never mentioned anything called valley threading to me. I'm not surprised. After the mission, your father argued strongly against the technique being taught to other pilots. He said it put too much strain on both aircraft and pilot, that the margin for error was too small. But he taught me everything about flying the A-10, Sarah insisted. Whitmore shook his head. He taught you everything he felt was safe to teach. But valley threading wasn't just a technique, Sarah. It was your father pushing himself and his aircraft beyond normal human and mechanical limits. The doctors who examined him afterward documented microfractures in his wrist bones from the physical strain of controlling the aircraft through those maneuvers for hours on end. Sarah absorbed this information silently. It explained the tremors she'd noticed in her father's hands during her teenage years, tremors he'd always dismissed as nothing serious. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand what you're volunteering for, Whitmore replied gravely. This isn't just a difficult rescue mission. What your father did, what you're proposing to do, exists at the very edge of what's physically possible. I believe you have the skills, and I know that aircraft has the capability. But I want you to go into this with your eyes open. Sarah looked back toward the bustling command center, where dozens of people were working to support a mission that might save 8 lives. Then she thought about her father, how he had never boasted about his achievements, never sought recognition, but had quietly passed on his knowledge in the guise of ordinary flying lessons. I understand the risks, she said finally, and I'm still volunteering. Whitmore studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Your father would be proud and concerned. A small smile touched his weathered face. Mostly concerned, I imagine. Back in the main briefing area, preparations were nearing completion. A flight suit had been found that approximately matched Sarah's size, and communications equipment was being prepared for installation in her helmet. We've analyzed the positions of all 8 pilots, Colonel Harrison explained, pointing to markers on the map. Based on terrain and weather patterns, we've calculated an optimal extraction sequence. The nearest pilot is here, in Shadow Canyon. The approach is narrow but straightforward, a good way to start before attempting the more challenging extractions. Sarah studied the proposed route, mentally walking through each step of the mission. 8 landings in confined spaces. 8 takeoffs in challenging conditions. Hours of intensive flying with no margin for error. I'll need to refuel after the 4th extraction, she said, tracing the route with her finger. There's no way to complete all 8 on a single tank, even with the auxiliary fuel cells I've installed. Agreed, Harrison nodded. We've arranged for a forward refueling point at this location. It's outside the worst of the electronic interference, and should be accessible between extractions 4 and 5. A young lieutenant approached with another update. Weather report just came in, sir. The storm system is intensifying faster than predicted. Visibility in the target area is dropping below minimums for standard operations. Harrison exchanged glances with Whitmore, both men clearly concerned by this development. This changes the timeline. If we're going to attempt this, it needs to happen now, before conditions deteriorate further. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then let's stop talking and start flying. The walk to her A-10 was surreal. Technicians had swarmed the aircraft, checking systems and installing enhanced communication equipment that might penetrate the electronic interference. Ground crew were topping off the fuel tanks, ensuring she would have every possible advantage. When she took off, as Sarah approached, she noticed something unexpected. The mocking attitude she'd encountered earlier from the F-22 pilots had vanished completely. Instead, pilots and ground crew alike stepped back respectfully as she passed. Some nodding in acknowledgement, others offering quiet words of encouragement. "They know what you're attempting," General Whitmore explained, walking beside her. "Word travels fast on a military base. Those pilots who were joking about your ancient aircraft earlier, they're now telling anyone who'll listen about the Sentinel extraction protocol and how your father saved their predecessors." At the aircraft, Sarah paused to complete a thorough external inspection. Despite the urgency of the mission, this was one step she wouldn't rush. Every inch of the A-10 needed to be perfect, every system functioning at optimal capacity. A senior mechanic approached as she checked the landing gear. "Miss Mitchell, we've reinforced the struts with additional shock absorption. It's not standard, but given what you're about to attempt." He trailed off, then added more quietly, "My brother was one of the pilots your father rescued in '02. I wanted to make sure you had every advantage he did, and then some." Sarah nodded her thanks, touched by the gesture and the connection to her father's legacy. As she completed her inspection, Colonel Harrison approached with a final update. "Latest communication from the stranded pilots confirms all are still secure, but reporting deteriorating conditions. The electronic interference is affecting their emergency beacons as well now. If this mission is delayed much longer, we may lose the ability to locate them accurately." Sarah climbed up the ladder and settled into the cockpit, her hands moving automatically through the familiar startup sequence. Despite the pressure of the moment, there was comfort in these practiced movements, the same pre-flight routine she'd performed hundreds of times before. As the engines spooled up with their characteristic rumble, she felt the aircraft come alive beneath her. For all its age and the mockery it had endured, this A-10 was about to attempt something no modern aircraft could accomplish. November-6-3-5-2, you are cleared for priority takeoff, the control tower announced. Good hunting and Godspeed. Copy that tower, November 6352 rolling. The A-10 thundered down the runway, lifting into the sky. With the steady reliability that had made it legendary among close air support pilots. As Sarah banked toward the mountains and the gathering storm beyond, she heard one final transmission from General Whitmore. "Remember what your father always said, Sarah. Trust the aircraft, trust your training. And when everything else fails, trust your instincts." Then she was alone, flying toward conditions that would test the limits of both pilot and machine. The weather deteriorated rapidly as Sarah approached the mountain range. What had appeared as distant haze from Holloman Air Force Base had transformed into a churning wall of dust and cloud, with powerful updrafts that buffeted the A-10 like a toy. The electronic interference was evident to her navigation displays, flickered intermittently, and radio communications became increasingly broken and static-filled. Control, November 6352. Approaching target area. Visibility decreasing, experiencing significant electronic interference, switching to analog backup systems. The response came back fragmented, November 6352. Copy, lost tracking. Proceed with caution. Sarah toggled several switches, disabling the more vulnerable digital systems and activating the A-10's original analog backup's old technology that was suddenly more valuable than all the advanced avionics in the world. Her heads-up display simplified, showing only essential information, but what remained was stable and reliable. The first extraction target was 15 miles ahead, a narrow canyon where Captain Elena Vasquez had made an emergency landing in her F-22. According to the briefing, the canyon was approximately 200 feet wide at its narrowest point, tight for an A-10's 57-foot wingspan, but manageable under normal conditions. These were not normal conditions. As Sarah descended toward the canyon entrance, visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile. The swirling dust created disorienting visual patterns that made it difficult to distinguish solid rock from empty space. This, she realized, was where her father's valley threading technique would become necessary, flying not by sight alone, but by developing an almost intuitive sense of the aircraft's relationship to the terrain. She reduced speed and altitude, bringing the A-10 down to just 200 feet above the canyon floor. At this height, the dust was slightly less dense, allowing brief glimpses of the rock walls rising on either side. The aircraft shuddered in the turbulent air but responded faithfully to every control input. Captain Vasquez, November 6, 352. If you can hear me, prepare for extraction and signal your position with emergency flares. No response came through the radio, but moments later, Sarah caught a flash of bright light ahead, a flare arcing up from the canyon floor before being quickly dispersed by the wind. Contact established, she reported, though she wasn't sure if her transmission was reaching base control anymore. Beginning approach to first extraction point. The canyon narrowed as she flew deeper, the walls closing in until they seemed to brush the wingtips of her aircraft. Every instinct trained into pilots warned against flying in such confined spaces, especially in conditions of poor visibility. But Sarah focused on the feel of the aircraft, the subtle cues that told her when she was drifting too close to one wall or the other. Another flare lit up the dust ahead, and Sarah caught her first glimpse of Vasquez's F-22, a dark shadow resting on a relatively flat section of the canyon floor. There was just enough space for her A-10 to land, but the approach would be challenging. The wind was gusting unpredictably, creating dangerous crosscurrents between the canyon walls. Sarah began her landing approach, reducing speed further and extending the landing gear. The A-10 bucked in the turbulent air, requiring constant corrections to maintain the proper glide path. This, she realized, was where the microfractures in her father's wrists had come from, the relentless physical strain of wrestling an aircraft through conditions it was never designed to handle. The landing zone appeared and disappeared in the swirling dust, forcing Sarah to rely as much on instruments and instinct as visual cues. She felt rather than saw the moment when the A-10 crossed the threshold of suitable landing terrain and brought the aircraft down with deliberate firmness. The reinforced landing gear absorbed the impact, and the A-10 rolled to a stop just short of where the canyon began to narrow again. Through the dust, Sarah saw a figure running toward her aircraft, Captain Vasquez in her flight suit, hunched against the stinging particles carried by the wind. Sarah opened the canopy just enough to allow the F-22 pilot to climb aboard, squeezing into the small space behind the pilot's seat that had been cleared for passengers. "Never thought I'd be so happy to see an A-10," Vasquez shouted over the engine noise as she secured herself. "When they said someone was attempting a sentinel extraction, I couldn't believe it." Sarah closed the canopy and began her takeoff calculations. The canyon was too narrow for a conventional takeoff run. She would need to use a short field technique, maximizing lift at minimal speed, and trusting the A-10's robust flight characteristics to keep them airborne in the turbulent conditions. "Hang on," she advised Vasquez. "This won't be the smoothest flight you've ever experienced." The A-10 lurched forward, gathering speed on the uneven terrain. Sarah felt the moment when sufficient lift developed and pulled back on the stick, bringing the aircraft into the air with barely 50 feet of canyon remaining before an impassable narrowing. The wings rocked violently as crosswinds hit them, but the A-10 continued climbing, threading its way back through the canyon toward more open air. One extraction complete, Sarah reported, hoping her transmission was reaching someone. Proceeding to second target. The second and third extractions followed a similar pattern, though each presented unique challenges. One canyon was so narrow that Sarah had to fly sideways for a short distance, using a technique her father had taught her for navigating confined spaces. Another required landing on a sloped surface that tested the limits of the A-10's landing gear. But each time the ancient Warthog performed flawlessly. What it lacked in stealth capabilities and advanced avionics, it made up for in rugged reliability and handling characteristics that allowed it to operate in conditions that would ground any modern fighter. By the time Sarah approached the fourth extraction site, a particularly challenging canyon with a dogleg turn that required precise navigation, she had developed a rhythm. The constant strain of controlling the aircraft through turbulence and confined spaces was taking its toll physically, but mentally she had found a state of focused calm. The fourth extraction proved to be the most difficult yet. The F-22 had landed in a box canyon with only one way in or out, and deteriorating weather conditions had caused a partial rock slide that narrowed the entrance further. Sarah circled above, studying what little she could see through breaks in the dust clouds. "Control, if you can hear me, the approach to the fourth extraction point is compromised. Entrance narrowed by rockfall. Attempting modified approach." She banked the A-10 into a steep turn, lining up with what appeared to be the widest part of the canyon entrance. This would require perfect timing and handling, entering at precisely the right angle and speed to thread through the narrowed passage without striking either wall. Sarah took a deep breath, then committed to the approach. The A-10 descended toward the canyon entrance, seeming to hang suspended for a moment before the walls closed in on both sides. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed the wingspan was too wide for the gap, but the aircraft slipped through with mere feet to spare on either side. The landing zone appeared ahead. Another F-22 Raptor, parked on a relatively flat expanse with its pilot standing nearby, waving an emergency flare. Sarah brought the A-10 down in what was becoming a practiced maneuver, though no less challenging for its familiarity. Major Robert Jackson, the fourth pilot, climbed aboard with expressions of disbelief and gratitude. "They told us someone was flying an A-10 through this mess to get us out. I thought they were joking until I heard your engines. That's the sweetest sound I've ever heard." With 4 pilots now crammed into the modified space behind her seat, Sarah began the takeoff sequence again. The additional weight made the aircraft more sluggish, but the powerful engines had plenty of reserve thrust to compensate. Threading back through the narrowed canyon entrance was even more challenging on the way out, but the A-10 responded to her inputs with predictable precision. As they emerged into marginally clearer air, Sarah set course for the forward refueling point that had been established for the mission. 4 down, 4 to go, she reported, her voice showing the first signs of strain from hours of intense concentration. Proceeding to refueling point before continuing extraction operations. The refueling stop was brief but essential. Ground crews worked with practiced efficiency, refilling the A-10's tanks while Sarah took the opportunity to stretch her cramped muscles and hydrate. The 4 rescued pilots were transferred to waiting helicopters that would transport them back to base, where medical teams would assess them for injuries or exposure. Colonel Harrison met Sarah beside the aircraft, his expression a mixture of respect and concern. "The weather's getting worse, and the electronic interference is spreading. The last 4 extraction points are in even more challenging terrain than the first 4. No one would think less of you if you decided the risk was too great to continue." Sarah looked toward the mountains where 4 more pilots were still stranded, then back at her A-10 being prepared for the next phase of the mission. "My father didn't stop halfway, Colonel. Neither will I." Harrison nodded, unsurprised by her response. "We've lost reliable communication with the remaining pilots. Their emergency beacons are still transmitting, but the signals are degraded by the interference. You'll be navigating almost entirely by dead reckoning and whatever visual cues you can gather. Understood, Sarah replied, climbing back into the cockpit. I'll find them. The second phase of the mission took Sarah deeper into the mountains, where the combination of terrain and weather created conditions that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. The electronic interference had intensified, rendering most communication impossible and forcing her to rely on the A-10's most basic systems. The fifth extraction point was located in a winding canyon that required a series of tight turns to navigate, turns that would have been challenging in clear conditions and became nearly impossible in the dust storm. Twice Sarah had to abort her approach when visibility dropped to zero, circling back to try again from a different angle. On the third attempt, she caught a glimpse of a signal flare through a momentary break in the dust cloud. Adjusting her approach, Sarah guided the A-10 down the twisting canyon, using every technique her father had taught her and some she improvised on the spot. The landing was rough but controlled, the A-10's robust gear absorbing the impact as it touched down on the uneven surface. Captain Thomas Rivera, the fifth pilot, emerged from behind a rock formation where he'd taken shelter from the worst of the wind and dust. I didn't think anyone could get through in these conditions, he said as he climbed aboard. They briefed U.S. on the Sentinel protocol during training, but everyone treated it like a legend, something that happened once but couldn't be repeated. Let's make sure it can, Sarah replied, beginning her takeoff calculations. The sixth and seventh extractions followed similar patterns, each presenting unique challenges that required all of Sarah's skill and the A-10's remarkable capabilities to overcome. By the time she had completed the seventh extraction, she had been flying continuously for over 10 hours, her wrists and shoulders aching from the constant strain of controlling the aircraft through turbulence and tight maneuvers. Only one pilot remained, Lieutenant James Connor, whose F-22 had made an emergency landing in what the maps identified as Devil's Corridor, the narrowest and most challenging canyon in the entire range. According to the briefing, the canyon walls closed to less than 75 feet apart at one point, leaving less than 10 feet of clearance on either side of the A-10's wings. As Sarah approached the area, the weather conditions deteriorated further. The wind had intensified to near hurricane force in some gusts, creating dangerous microbursts and downdrafts between the mountain peaks. Visibility was minimal, with the swirling dust occasionally clearing just enough to glimpse the terrain before closing in again. Control, November 6352. Approaching final extraction point. Conditions extremely poor. Attempting to locate Devil's Corridor entrance. No response came through the static-filled radio, but Sarah hadn't expected one. She was on her own now, navigating by memory of the maps she'd studied and whatever fleeting glimpses of terrain she could catch through the storm. After 20 minutes of careful searching, she located what appeared to be the entrance to Devil's Corridor, a dark slash between towering rock walls, partially obscured by swirling dust. Sarah circled once, assessing the approach and calculating angles, then committed to the descent. The A-10 shuddered violently as it entered the corridor, caught in crosswinds that seemed determined to dash it against the canyon walls. Sarah's hands moved constantly on the controls, making dozens of tiny adjustments every second to keep the aircraft centered in the increasingly narrow space. This, she realized, must be what General Whitmore had meant by valley threading, not just flying through confined spaces, but becoming one with the aircraft until every movement, every response, became instinctive rather than calculated. It wasn't a technique that could be taught. It could only be experienced and internalized through the kind of desperate necessity her father had faced 20 years earlier. The corridor narrowed further, the walls now seeming to brush against the wingtips, though in reality there were still feet of clearance on either side. Sarah felt rather than saw the approaching dogleg turn that the maps had indicated a sharp 80-degree bend that would require perfect timing and control to navigate. She banked the A-10 into the turn, feeling the G-forces push her into her seat as the aircraft responded. For one heart-stopping moment, the left wingtip appeared to be on a collision course with the canyon wall, but Sarah adjusted with micrometer-meters precision, and the A-10 slipped through the gap with inches to spare. Beyond the turn, the canyon widened slightly into a natural amphitheater where Lieutenant Connor's F-22 had found just enough space to land. Sarah caught sight of emergency flares burning despite the wind, marking a possible landing zone beside the stranded Raptor. The approach to the landing zone was possibly the most challenging flying Sarah had ever attempted. Downdrafts and updrafts alternated unpredictably, causing the A-10 to drop or surge with little warning. The dust reduced visibility to mere yards, at times forcing her to rely on instruments and instinct for the final approach. When the landing gear finally touched down, Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief before beginning the shutdown sequence. Through the swirling dust, she saw Lieutenant Connor approaching, his flight suit covered in fine powder from the storm, but his movements indicating he was uninjured. As he climbed aboard, Connor shook his head in disbelief. "They told me someone was coming in a Warthog. I thought they were hallucinating from dehydration. No one flies in conditions like this." "Apparently someone does," Sarah replied with a tired smile. "Now let's get out of here before this canyon decides to keep us both." The takeoff from Devil's Corridor proved to be the final test of both aircraft and pilot. With the added weight of the 8th passenger and fuel reserves running low, the A-10 needed every foot of available space to become airborne before the canyon narrowed again. Sarah applied full power, feeling the aircraft surge forward across the uneven ground. The airspeed indicator climbed slowly, too slowly, it seemed, as the narrow section of the canyon approached. Just when it appeared they might not have sufficient runway remaining, Sarah felt the subtle change in the aircraft's movement that indicated sufficient lift had developed. She pulled back on the stick, bringing the A-10 into the air with barely 40 feet of canyon remaining. The aircraft climbed sluggishly at first, buffeted by crosswinds that threatened to push it into the canyon walls. But the powerful engines continued to thrust them forward and upward, and gradually the walls fell away as they emerged from Devil's Corridor into slightly more open air. "Final extraction complete," Sarah reported, not knowing if anyone could hear her through the interference. 8 of 8. Returning to base. As she set course back toward Holloman Air Force Base, navigating by dead reckoning through the continuing storm, Sarah felt a profound connection to her father and the legacy he had created. 20 years apart, father and daughter had faced the same impossible challenge in the same remarkable aircraft, and both had prevailed. The old Warthog, dismissed as obsolete and mocked by pilots of more advanced aircraft, had once again proven its unique value. Some missions didn't require stealth capabilities or supersonic speeds. Some missions required the ability to operate in conditions that would ground any other aircraft, the ability to land and take off in confined spaces, to withstand punishment that would tear a more delicate airframe apart, to fly low and slow, when necessary without losing control. As the storm began to clear and Holloman Air Force Base appeared on the horizon, Sarah keyed her radio one last time. "Control, November 6352 returning with the final extraction. Request priority landing." This time, a response came through clearly. "November 6352, this is Holloman Control. You are cleared for priority landing on runway 16, welcome home." The landing at Holloman Air Force Base was unlike any Sarah had experienced before. As the A-10 touched down on runway 16, she saw dozens of vehicles lining the tarmac, ambulances ready to receive the rescued pilots, maintenance crews prepared to service her aircraft, and what appeared to be every available base personnel gathered to witness the completion of a mission many had deemed impossible. November 6352. Taxi to the marked area at the end of the runway, the control tower instructed. Medical teams are standing by. Sarah guided the weathered Warthog toward the designated spot, her body finally registering the full extent of her exhaustion now that the mission was complete. Every muscle ached from the constant strain of controlling the aircraft through turbulence and tight maneuvers for over 12 hours. Her eyes burned from intense focus and the occasional dust that had seeped into the cockpit despite the sealed canopy. As she completed the shutdown sequence, Sarah heard the gathered crowd erupt in spontaneous applause. It was a sound rarely heard on military airfields, a departure from the professional restraint that typically characterized Air Force operations. But today was anything but typical. The canopy opened, and Lieutenant Connor, the final rescued pilot, climbed down to be immediately surrounded by medical personnel. Sarah remained in her seat for a moment longer, running through the final items on her checklist despite her exhaustion. Some habits were too deeply ingrained to abandon, even after pushing human endurance to its limits. Colonel Harrison and General Whitmore approached as she finally emerged from the cockpit, removing her helmet to reveal sweat-dampened hair and a face etched with fatigue, but glowing with quiet satisfaction. 8 for 8, Harrison said simply, offering a hand to help her down the ladder. Against all odds and expert opinions, "You've done something extraordinary today, Miss Mitchell." Sarah accepted his assistance, her legs unsteady after so many hours confined to the cockpit. "The aircraft did the extraordinary part, Colonel. I just pointed it in the right direction." General Whitmore's weathered face broke into a rare smile. "That's almost exactly what your father said 20 years ago." Though the flight surgeons who examined him afterward might disagree about who did the heavy lifting. A medical team approached, eager to check Sarah for signs of dehydration or injury, but she waved them toward the rescued pilots instead. "I'm fine. They were exposed to the elements longer than I was." Harrison nodded to the medics, confirming her directive. "Give us a minute. Then Ms. Mitchell will submit to a full examination." It wasn't a request, and Sarah didn't argue. She knew the physical toll the mission had taken, even if adrenaline was currently masking the worst of it. As the medical team withdrew, Whitmore gestured toward the A-10. "Your aircraft performed beyond all specifications today. Our maintenance chief wants to do a full inspection, says he's never seen an A-10 put through maneuvers like that before, not even in combat situations." Sarah turned to look at the Warthog, its dull paint now further scuffed and dust-streaked from the mission. In the late afternoon sun, it looked simultaneously ancient and indomitable, a relic that had proven more valuable than all the cutting-edge technology that had failed in the storm. "I'd like to be there for the inspection," she said. "No one knows this aircraft better than I do." "Tomorrow," Harrison replied firmly. "Right now, you need medical attention and rest. Doctor's orders and mine." A young lieutenant approached, clearly nervous about interrupting. "Excuse me, sir. The Joint Chiefs are on the secure line. They're requesting an immediate briefing on the Sentinel extraction." He hesitated, then added, "And the Secretary of Defense is with them." Harrison sighed. "Political attention already. I suppose it was inevitable once word got out that we had 8 F-22s stranded in hostile terrain." He turned to Sarah. "This will take some time. The medical team will get you sorted out, and we'll continue our conversation later." As Harrison departed with the lieutenant, General Whitmore remained behind, his expression thoughtful. "You know this changes things, don't you? 20 years ago, your father's mission was classified, immediately kept quiet to protect the techniques he developed and to avoid acknowledging the vulnerability of our aircraft to certain types of electronic warfare." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. "But with 8 F-22s and pilots involved this time, there are too many witnesses. The story will get out." "It's already out," Whitmore confirmed. Social media reports started appearing the moment the first rescued pilots reached base. By tomorrow morning, every news outlet in the country will be running the story of how an obsolete A-10 saved 8 F-22 Raptors when nothing else could reach them. He gestured toward a group of the rescued pilots now receiving medical attention, but animatedly describing their experiences to anyone who would listen. Those young men and women aren't going to downplay what happened today. They're going to tell everyone how the aircraft the Air Force has been trying to retire for decades was the only thing that could save them when their $150 million jets were grounded. Sarah hadn't considered the political and public relations aspects of the mission. She'd been focused solely on the task at hand, finding and extracting stranded pilots from impossible terrain. But now she realized the broader implications of what had occurred. "So what happens next?" she asked. Whitmore's expression turned serious. "That depends partly on you. The Pentagon will want to control the narrative, portray this as a unique emergency scenario that doesn't reflect on the overall capabilities of our modern aircraft. They'll acknowledge your skill and courage, but they'll try to frame it as an exception rather than a rule. And what do you think they should do?" "I think," Whitmore said carefully, "that today proved something your father and I have been arguing for 20 years. There are certain missions that require specialized aircraft with unique capabilities that can't always be replaced by stealth technology and advanced avionics." He gestured toward her A-10. "That aircraft has successfully completed a mission that none of our modern fighters could have attempted. Twice in 2 decades, when the situation was at its most desperate, it wasn't an F-22 or F-35 that saved the day. It was an A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft designed in the 1970s that the Air Force has repeatedly tried to retire." Sarah understood his point. The military's push toward ever more advanced and expensive aircraft had sometimes come at the expense of proven platforms that excelled in specific roles. The A-10, with its remarkable durability, low-speed handling characteristics, and ability to operate in adverse conditions, had capabilities no other aircraft could match, capabilities that had proven decisive today. "What would you like me to do?" she asked. "Just tell the truth," Whitmore replied. "When the questions come, and they will come, from the media, from Congress, from military review boards, tell them exactly what happened today. Explain what this aircraft can do that nothing else in our inventory can match." Before Sarah could respond, a medical officer approached insistently. "Miss Mitchell, I need to examine you immediately. You've been operating under extreme conditions for over 12 hours without rest." Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how completely exhausted she was now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "We'll continue this later," she said to Whitmore, who nodded in understanding. The medical examination confirmed what Sarah already knew. She was suffering from extreme fatigue, mild dehydration, and muscular strain throughout her arms and shoulders from the constant physical effort of controlling the aircraft in turbulent conditions. The flight surgeon prescribed rest, fluids, and anti-inflammatory medication for the strained muscles. "You're experiencing similar physical effects to what we see in pilots after extremely demanding combat missions," the doctor explained. "Your body has been through the equivalent of running a marathon while simultaneously performing complex mechanical tasks requiring precise coordination." Sarah wasn't surprised. She'd felt the strain building throughout the mission, particularly during the most challenging canyon maneuvers. "My father experienced the same thing, didn't he? After the original Sentinel mission?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "I've reviewed the medical records from that incident. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell suffered more severe physical trauma, including microfractures in his wrist bones and significant muscle tears in his shoulders. The fact that you've avoided similar injuries speaks to your technique and physical conditioning, and possibly to the modifications I've made to the aircraft," Sarah added. "The control systems are more responsive than they were in my father's day." Less physical force required for the same maneuvers. That would certainly help, the doctor agreed. Nevertheless, I'm ordering at least 48 hours of rest before you even think about flying again. Your body needs time to recover. Sarah didn't argue. Now that the mission was complete, her body was demanding the rest it had been denied during the long hours of intense concentration and physical strain. She was escorted to guest quarters on the base, where she showered away the dust and sweat of the mission before collapsing into bed. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of her father, and whether he had felt this same mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride after the original Sentinel mission 20 years earlier. Sarah awoke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of aircraft taking off and landing. For a moment, she was disoriented, her mind still caught in dreams of narrow canyons and swirling dust. Then reality reasserted itself. She was at Holloman Air Force Base, and yesterday she had accomplished something remarkable. A glance at her watch showed it was nearly noon. She had slept for over 14 hours, yet her body still felt the aftereffects of the mission. Her shoulders and wrists ached, and there was a stiffness in her neck that spoke of hours spent in rigid concentration. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found a young airman standing outside with a garment bag and a message. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell. Colonel Harrison asked me to bring you these," he said, handing over the bag. "There's a briefing in 1 hour in the command center. The colonel thought you might appreciate fresh clothes." Inside the bag, Sarah found a new flight suit, not standard Air Force issue, but a civilian version similar to the one she typically wore, along with a T-shirt bearing the Holloman AFB insignia. "Please tell the colonel I appreciate the gesture," she said. "I'll be there." After the airman departed, Sarah checked her phone and found it inundated with messages and notifications. News of the Sentinel extraction had indeed spread rapidly. There were missed calls from reporters, old Air Force colleagues, and friends who had seen her name in the news. Even her social media accounts, normally quiet, were overflowing with comments and messages. But one message stood out among they. Rest a simple text from her father. "I heard what you did. Call me when you can." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. Of course he had heard, probably from General Whitmore directly. She would call him after the briefing when she had more time to explain everything that had happened. An hour later, freshly dressed and feeling somewhat recovered after a large meal in the officers' mess, Sarah entered the command center. The room fell silent as she appeared, and she was startled to see not just Colonel Harrison and General Whitmore, but a collection of senior officers, including several with general stars on their shoulders. "Ms. Mitchell," Harrison greeted her, gesturing to an empty chair. "Thank you for joining us. We were just discussing yesterday's events and their implications for future operations." Sarah took the offered seat, aware of the evaluating gazes fixed on her from around the table. One officer in particular, a 3-star general with a stern expression, seemed to be studying her with particular intensity. "For those who haven't been introduced," Harrison continued, "this is Sarah Mitchell, the civilian pilot who executed the Sentinel extraction protocol yesterday, successfully recovering 8 F-22 pilots from terrain that was inaccessible by any other means." The stern-looking general spoke first. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm General Victor Blackwell, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. I've spent the morning reviewing the preliminary reports of your mission yesterday. To say they're remarkable would be an understatement." His tone gave no indication whether he considered this remarkableness a positive or negative development. Sarah merely nodded in acknowledgement, waiting to see where the conversation would lead. "The Joint Chiefs have convened an emergency session to discuss the implications," Blackwell continued. 8 F-22 Raptors, the most advanced air superiority fighters in our inventory, were effectively neutralized by a combination of weather conditions and electronic countermeasures. Meanwhile, An A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft we've been trying to retire for over a decade, proved capable of operating in those same conditions. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Do you understand the dilemma this creates for our strategic planning? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I understand that different aircraft have different capabilities, General. The F-22 is designed for air superiority missions at high altitudes. The A-10 was designed for close air support in adverse conditions. Yesterday's mission fell squarely into the latter category. A diplomatic answer, Blackwell noted. But it doesn't address the public relations challenge we're facing. By this afternoon, every media outlet in the country will be running stories about how an obsolete aircraft saved our most advanced fighters. Congress will inevitably question our procurement priorities and aircraft retirement schedules. Another officer, a woman with Colonel's Eagles, spoke up. General, with respect, perhaps we should be questioning those priorities. Yesterday's events demonstrated a capability gap in our current force structure. A gap that was filled by a civilian pilot flying a privately owned aircraft, Blackwell countered. Hardly a sustainable solution for military operations. General Whitmore cleared his throat. If I may, General Blackwell. 20 years ago, when Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell performed the original Sentinel extraction, the Air Force had the opportunity to develop this capability further, to train additional pilots in the technique and maintain a specialized squadron for precisely these kinds of missions. Instead, the decision was made to classify the incident and pretend it never happened. Blackwell's expression hardened. That decision was made at the highest levels for sound strategic reasons. And now history has repeated itself, Whitmore pressed. Only this time, there are too many witnesses to classify it away. 8 F-22 pilots are alive today because of an aircraft and a capability that the Air Force has repeatedly tried to eliminate. The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah remained silent, recognizing that she was witnessing an internal military debate that had likely been simmering for years. The Sentinel extraction, both her father's original mission and her recreation of it, had simply brought these underlying disagreements to the surface. Colonel Harrison intervened before the discussion could become more heated. Perhaps we should hear from Ms. Mitchell directly. She's the only person alive who has successfully executed this mission, who isn't bound by military protocols against public statements. All eyes turned to Sarah, who suddenly understood the subtext. As a civilian, she could speak freely about yesterday's events in ways that active-duty military personnel could not. Her perspective would carry significant weight in the public discourse that was certain to follow. What would you like to know? She asked carefully. Your honest assessment, Harrison replied. Based on your experience yesterday, could any other aircraft in our current inventory have accomplished what your A-10 did? Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. No, she said finally. The mission required a unique combination of capabilities: the ability to fly slowly enough to navigate confined spaces, the durability to withstand turbulence and dust, the simplicity of analog backup systems that aren't vulnerable to electronic interference, and the ability to land and take off in extremely restricted terrain. No other current aircraft combines all those capabilities. Not even helicopters? Blackwell challenged. The wind conditions made helicopter operations impossible in the canyons, Sarah replied. The downdrafts and microbursts would have overwhelmed their control systems. Several attempts were made before my mission was authorized, correct? Harrison nodded confirmation. 3 different helicopter teams attempted approaches and had to abort due to unacceptable risk levels. Sarah continued. The A-10 was designed with a specific mission profile in mind: close air support in adverse conditions, operating from forward airfields, withstanding battle damage, and protecting the pilot. Those design priorities created an aircraft with capabilities that have proven valuable in unexpected ways, including yesterday's extraction mission. She paused, then added what she felt was the most important point. But the aircraft is only part of the equation. The Sentinel extraction protocol requires specific flying techniques that push the boundaries of conventional aviation. My father developed those techniques under extreme pressure 20 years ago. I was fortunate that he passed that knowledge to me, even if he never explicitly identified it as preparation for this kind of mission. Blackwell's expression remained skeptical, but some of the other officers were nodding in agreement. The female colonel spoke again. Ms. Mitchell raises an important point. We need both the right aircraft and properly trained pilots to execute these kinds of specialized missions. Perhaps instead of retiring our remaining A-10 fleet, we should be developing a dedicated Sentinel extraction capability. At what cost? Blackwell countered. We have limited resources and multiple competing priorities. Creating a specialized unit for a mission that has been required exactly twice in 20 years is difficult to justify. At what cost not to? Whitmore asked. Quietly. 8 pilots and 8 aircraft worth billions of dollars were saved yesterday. How do we calculate the value of that capability? The debate continued for another hour, with Sarah occasionally providing technical details about the mission when asked but otherwise listening as the military officers argued the strategic implications. It was clear that no consensus would be reached in this meeting. The issues were too complex, the institutional positions too entrenched. Eventually, Colonel Harrison brought the discussion to a close. We've all made our positions clear. General, Blackwell will present a summary to the Joint Chiefs this afternoon. In the meantime, we need to prepare for the media attention that's already building. Ms. Mitchell, are you willing to participate in a carefully managed press conference? Sarah hesitated, thinking about General Whitmore's earlier advice to tell the truth when questions came. I'm willing, she said finally. But I won't downplay what happened yesterday or the capabilities of the A-10. That aircraft saved 8 lives when nothing else could, and I believe that fact deserves honest acknowledgement. Blackwell frowned, but several other officers nodded. In apparent agreement, Harrison looked to the senior officers for guidance, and after a moment of silent communication, nodded. Understood. We'll schedule the press conference for tomorrow morning after you've had more time to rest. In the meantime, our public affairs team will prepare a statement about the mission highlights. As the meeting broke up, General Whitmore approached Sarah privately. You handled that well, he said quietly. Blackwell represents the institutional view, always looking toward the next generation of technology, always eager to retire the old, to make way for the new. It's not wrong. Exactly. But it sometimes overlooks the unique capabilities that can be lost in the transition. Sarah nodded. My father used to say that every aircraft has its own personality and purpose. The A-10 wasn't designed to be pretty or fast or stealthy. It was designed to be effective in specific conditions, to take punishment and keep flying, to operate close to the ground where other aircraft can't, to protect its pilot above all else. Exactly, Whitmore agreed. And yesterday proved that those qualities still matter, even in an age of stealth technology and beyond visual range engagements. He hesitated, then added, Speaking of your father, he called while you were sleeping. I took the liberty of updating him on your condition and the mission outcome. He's understandably proud and concerned. Said he's catching the next flight out here. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension at the news. She hadn't seen her father in person for several months, though they spoke regularly by phone. Their relationship had always been close, but somewhat reserved, complicated by his reluctance to discuss certain aspects of his military service, and her determination to follow in his footsteps, despite his occasional misgivings. When does he arrive? She asked. This evening, Whitmore replied. I've arranged for a car to meet him at the airport. He expressed particular interest in seeing the aircraft again, said he wanted to examine how it held up during the mission. Sarah smiled at that. It was so characteristic of her father's concern for her well-being, but also professional curiosity about the performance of an aircraft he had once pushed to its absolute limits. "Thank you," she said simply. Whitmore nodded, understanding the gratitude extended beyond the immediate arrangements. "Your father and I served together for many years. He's one of the finest pilots I've ever known, and based on yesterday's evidence, that talent runs in the family." As Whitmore departed, Sarah found herself alone in the command center, contemplating the events of the past 24 hours and their implications for the future. Her life had changed irrevocably, that much was certain. What remained to be seen was how the military would respond to the lessons of the Sentinel extraction, and what role she might play in ensuring those lessons weren't forgotten again. Outside the window, she could see her A-10 on the tarmac, surrounded by maintenance crews conducting a thorough inspection. The aircraft looked almost defiant in the bright sunlight, weathered and utilitarian amid the sleek, modern fighters that dominated the airfield. An ancient warrior that had proven its worth when modern technology had failed. Sarah watched as one of the rescued F-22 pilots approached the A-10, running a hand along its fuselage with what appeared to be reverence. The contrast was striking, a pilot of America's most advanced fighter paying homage to an aircraft that predated his birth by decades. In that moment, Sarah understood that the debate she had witnessed in the command center would continue long after this particular incident faded from headlines. The military, like any large institution, evolved slowly, often resistant to lessons that challenged established thinking. But yesterday's mission had provided evidence too compelling to ignore, evidence that sometimes the old ways still had value in a world obsessed with the new. Her phone buzzed with a message from the base's public affairs officer, requesting a preliminary meeting to prepare for tomorrow's press conference. Sarah sent a quick acknowledgement, then turned away from the window. There would be time later to check on her aircraft and prepare for her father's arrival. For now, she had a story to tell, a story about an aircraft that had been dismissed as obsolete until the moment when nothing else could do what needed to be done. A story about legacy and innovation, about the value of maintaining diverse capabilities even as technology evolved. And perhaps most importantly, a story about how sometimes the most valuable tool isn't the newest or the most expensive, it's the one that's right for the job, regardless of age or appearance. The press conference was scheduled for 09:00 the following morning, but Sarah's day began much earlier. She stood on the tarmac at dawn, watching as the first golden rays of sunlight illuminated her A-10. Sarah listened attentively but maintained her position on key points, particularly regarding the A-10's unique capabilities and the implications for future force structure decisions. By the time they broke for a short recess before the actual press conference, it was clear that Sarah's testimony would not be as tightly controlled as the Pentagon might have preferred. But they also recognized that attempting to muzzle her would create its own media problems, especially given the public interest in the dramatic rescue story. The press conference itself was held in a large auditorium on base, with dozens of media representatives present and more participating virtually. Camera crews from major networks had set up along the back wall, and photographers jostled for position near the front. Colonel Harrison opened with a straightforward account of the mission. Circumstances: 8 F-22s, grounded by a combination of weather conditions and electronic interference. CONVENT, IONAL rescue attempts, thwarted by the same factors. And the successful implementation of the Sentinel extraction protocol using Sarah's A-10. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she approached the podium with the same calm focus she brought to flying. The lights and cameras didn't intimidate her. After navigating canyons in zero visibility, facing reporters seemed relatively straightforward. 2 days ago, I flew my A-10 Thunderbolt II through conditions that would ground most aircraft. She began. 8 F-22 pilots are alive today because of capabilities unique to an aircraft design that's nearly 50 years old. That's not a criticism of modern fighter technology. It's a recognition that different aircraft are designed for different mission profiles. And sometimes the older designs still have valuable capabilities that newer aircraft don't replicate. She continued with a brief, technical description of the mission challenges and how the A-10's specific characteristics had made the extraction possible. Throughout her statement, she was careful to emphasize facts rather than opinions, allowing the audience to draw their own conclusions about the implications. When the question period began, it quickly became apparent that the media had latched onto the David versus Goliath narrative of an obsolete aircraft saving America's most advanced fighters. Ms. Mitchell called out a reporter from the Washington Post. Would you say this mission demonstrates that the Air Force's attempts to retire the A-10 fleet have been misguided? Sarah considered her response carefully. I would say that this mission demonstrates the value of maintaining diverse capabilities within our air fleet. The A-10 was designed for a specific role: close air support in adverse conditions. But those design priorities created an aircraft with unique abilities that proved valuable in an unexpected scenario. Another reporter jumped in. But isn't it true that the Air Force has repeatedly tried to retire the A-10, claiming newer aircraft could fulfill its role? Military procurement decisions involve complex trade-offs, Sarah replied diplomatically. Modern fighter aircraft excel in many mission profiles. But as this incident demonstrated, there are still scenarios where the A-10's particular combination of durability, analog backup systems, and low-speed handling characteristics provide capabilities nothing else can match. The questions continued for nearly an hour, ranging from technical details about the extraction technique to broader implications for military planning. Throughout, Sarah maintained a balance between honesty about the mission's significance and respect for the military's strategic challenges. One of the final questions came from a young reporter who had been quiet until then. Ms. Mitchell, your father performed a similar extraction mission 20 years ago, which remained classified until now. Do you see your mission as continuing his legacy? And what do you think that legacy means for the future of military aviation? The question touched on something deeper than equipment capabilities or strategic planning. It went to the heart of why Sarah had pursued aviation in the first place, and why she had specifically chosen to restore and fly her father's A-10. My father taught me that the most important quality in a pilot isn't technical skill or courage, though both are necessary, she said. It's judgment, knowing your aircraft's capabilities, knowing your own limitations, and making decisions that maximize the former while respecting the latter. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The legacy of the Sentinel Protocol isn't just about a specific mission technique or aircraft capability. It's about maintaining the knowledge and skills that allow us to respond effectively when conventional approaches fail. Sometimes that means preserving older technologies alongside newer ones. Sometimes it means passing down techniques that exist outside the standard training manuals. The reporter pressed further. And what about your personal legacy? Will you continue flying rescue missions in your A-10? Sarah smiled slightly. I fly survey missions and participate in search and rescue operations when needed. If yesterday's events highlight the continuing value of these capabilities, perhaps the conversation about the A-10's future will evolve. But whether I'm involved in that evolution depends on many factors beyond my control. As the press conference concluded, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the mission itself. She had managed to articulate the importance of what had happened without either understating its significance or overstating its implications. The truth, as she saw it, had been presented clearly and honestly. Outside the auditorium, she found her father waiting, a hint of pride visible beneath his typically reserved expression. Well done, he said simply. You stayed true to the facts without getting drawn into the political dimensions. I learned from the best, Sarah replied with a small smile. Though you never had to deal with the media circus after your mission. Different times, Marcus acknowledged. Classification was simpler then, before social media and smartphones made every event potentially public. They walked together toward the flight line, where Sarah's A-10 stood ready for departure. The maintenance crews had completed their work, and Colonel Harrison had authorized her to return to her home base whenever she felt ready. General Whitmore mentioned you'd been offered a position, Marcus said as they approached the aircraft. Something about developing a formal training program for the Sentinel Protocol, Sarah nodded. The Air Force is establishing a specialized unit for high-risk extractions in challenging terrain. They want me to help design the training program and possibly serve as a civilian instructor. Are you considering it? I am, she admitted. Not for the recognition or the paycheck, but because it means the capability won't be lost again. The knowledge will be preserved and passed on to pilots who might need it someday. They reached the A-10, its weathered surface gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. The maintenance crews had cleaned away the dust and grime from the mission, but had thankfully left the aircraft's character intact, the small dents and scratches that told the story of its long service. She's ready to go home, Marcus said, patting the fuselage affectionately. Though I suspect home might have a different meaning now, Sarah understood what he meant. The A-10 with tail number 635 to 147 was no longer just a personal aircraft. Used for civilian flying, it had reclaimed its place in military history, becoming once again a symbol of capabilities that newer, more advanced aircraft couldn't replicate. I'm thinking of donating it to the Air Force Museum eventually, she said, after I've finished using it to help develop the training program. This aircraft has earned its place in history twice now. Marcus nodded, approval evident in his expression. A fitting retirement. Though I suspect she has a few more missions left before then. Sarah began her pre-flight inspection, moving around the aircraft with practiced efficiency. As she checked each control surface and system, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a child watching her father fly, to an Air Force maintenance engineer, to a civilian pilot restoring his old A-10, and finally to executing a mission that many had deemed impossible. The aircraft had been a constant throughout that journey, a physical link between generations of aviators who understood that, sometimes, the oldest tools were still the best ones for certain jobs. As she completed her inspection, Sarah found Colonel Harrison approaching across the tarmac. All set for departure? He asked. Yes, sir. Just finishing the pre-flight checks. Harrison nodded, then handed her an envelope. Official commendation from the Secretary of the Air Force. They wanted to present it formally, but I suggested you might prefer something less ceremonial. Sarah accepted the envelope with a nod of thanks, knowing she would read its contents. Later, in private, I appreciate that, Colonel, and everything else you've done over the past few days. The appreciation goes both ways, Ms. Mitchell, Harrison replied. What you accomplished wasn't just a remarkable feat of flying. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes our most valuable assets aren't the newest or the most technologically advanced. He glanced at the A-10. This old warrior and pilots like you and your father represent something we can't afford to lose in our pursuit of the next generation of technology, the human judgment and mechanical reliability that serve as our last line of defense when everything else fails. Sarah understood the significance of his words, coming from a senior officer who would help shape future Air Force doctrine and procurement decisions. The Sentinel extraction hadn't just saved 8 pilots, it had potentially influenced how military aviation would evolve in the coming years. Safe flight home, Harrison said, extending his hand. And I hope we'll be seeing you back here soon to help develop that training program. After he departed, Sarah completed her preparations and climbed into the cockpit. The familiar surroundings welcomed her like an old friend, each switch and gauge exactly where her hands expected them to be. This was home in a way that transcended physical locations, the pilot's seat of an aircraft that had carried her through the most challenging flying of her career. Her father stood back at a respectful distance as she started the engines, their powerful rumble vibrating through the airframe. He raised a hand in salute as she taxied toward the runway, not a military salute, but the more personal acknowledgement between aviators who understand the unique bond between pilot and aircraft. As the A-10 lifted off from Holloman Air Force Base, banking gently toward home, Sarah felt a profound sense of continuity. 20 years separated her mission from her father's, yet the essential truth remained the same. When the most sophisticated technology failed, it was the combination of a rugged, reliable aircraft and a skilled, determined pilot that had saved the day. The military would continue to develop ever more advanced fighters with stealth capabilities and networked systems. But the lessons of the Sentinel extraction would endure a reminder that diversity of capabilities remained as important as technological superiority, and that sometimes the aircraft others mockingly called ancient was exactly the tool needed when all else failed. Sarah Mitchell and her A-10 Thunderbolt II, with tail number 635 to 147, had written a new chapter in a story that began with her father 2 decades earlier. It wasn't just a tale of heroic rescue against impossible odds. It was a testament to the enduring value of aircraft designed with different priorities: durability over delicacy, reliability over complexity, survivability over stealth. As the A-10 cruised through clear skies toward home, its pilot carried with her not just the official commendation in her flight bag, but something far more valuable: the knowledge that she had proven beyond doubt what her father had always taught her, that every aircraft had its purpose, and that the true measure of an aircraft's worth wasn't its age or appearance, but its ability to accomplish the mission when nothing else could. In hangars and officer clubs across the Air Force, the story of how an ancient Warthog had saved 8 F-22s would be told and retold, inspiring a new generation of pilots to look beyond the sleek profiles and advanced avionics of modern fighters, to understand the fundamental qualities that made an aircraft truly capable in the most challenging conditions. And in the years to come, when military planners debated force structure and aircraft retirement schedules, someone would inevitably mention the Sentinel extraction protocol and the A-10 that had twice accomplished what no other aircraft could. A powerful reminder that sometimes the old ways still had their place in a world obsessed with the new. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.